Bonjour et bienvenue à la conférence de presse sur le rapport annuel 2021-2022 du Bureau de l'enquêteur correctionnel. Whenever you're ready, you can start.
Good morning and welcome. Earlier this morning, my latest annual report was tabled before Parliament. This is the office's 49th annual report and my 6th serving as Correctional Investigator of Canada. After nearly 3 years of COVID restriction, I'm excited to hold an in-person press conference again. I look forward to speaking with members of the media about the important work of my office. J'ai le plaisir d'être accompagné aujourd'hui.
I'm pleased to be joined by Mr. Blaise Nadala, who serves in the capacity of Deputy Director of Investigations. Blaise was one of the lead investigators looking into the experiences of Black people in Canadian penitentiaries. We will hear from him in a moment.
Part of this year's annual report, I am releasing an update of the office's 2013 groundbreaking investigation into the experiences of Black prisoners in Canada. This investigation not only serves to update our previous findings, it also assesses the Correctional Service of Canada's progress in addressing concerns documented nearly a decade ago. First, Black prisoners continue to be significantly overrepresented in federal custody. Today, Black people comprise 9.2% of the total incarcerated population, despite representing only about 3.5% of the overall Canadian population. Overall, I am disappointed to report that the problems and barriers identified in 2013, including discrimination, stereotyping, racial bias, and labeling of Black prisoners, remain as pervasive and persistent as before. In fact, the situation of Black people behind bars in Canada today is as bad and in some respect worse than it was when we first looked into these issues nearly a decade ago. Before I elaborate further on the findings and recommendations, Blaise will provide some important background and insight into how we went about conducting this investigation and what he heard when interviewing Black prisoners. Blaise.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this unique press conference. I'd like to thank the correctional investigator. So thank you, Mr. Zinger, for enabling me to participate in this exercise and be in this room, albeit briefly, to be the voice and face of my colleagues. And by that, I mean the people who work at the ICC who have participated in the work being presented today. To conduct the 2013 investigation referred to by the correctional investigator, our office used a tried and true methodology using a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods to assess the experiences and outcomes of Black prisoners. We reviewed relevant research and policy deemed to be relevant. We analyzed CSC data and conducted focus interviews with the Correctional Service staff, incarcerated persons, academics, and Black community group representatives. Since the largest concentrations of Black prisoners are incarcerated in Ontario and Quebec, we focused on these two provinces, but we did not leave out the rest of the country. We conducted interviews with inmates at Spring Hill Institution in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Institution in New Brunswick. We also interviewed, in total, we interviewed more than 50 Black prisoners for this investigation. And we also interviewed community groups where they existed. Our aim with this investigation was primarily to create a space where Black prisoners could speak honestly and directly without fear of retaliation about their lived experience behind bars. We wanted to hear what they had to say about being Black and imprisoned in a Canadian federal penitentiary. We were interested in anything that made their experience unique, and we wanted to ensure that what they experienced actually reflected the values that were set out in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Outcome measures for Black prisoners, such as involvement in use of force, security classification, and placement at transfers, were collected from CSC's administrative databases. In analyzing this data, we determined whether outcomes were unequal or disproportionate for Black prisoners by comparing their representation in certain indicators against the total inmate population. For example, this analysis enabled us to determine that Black prisoners today constitute just over 9% of the total inmate population, yet they represent about 15% of the population at maximum security penitentiaries. In other words, Black individuals are overrepresented at maximum security facilities. Using similar methods, we were able to determine that Black prisoners are more likely to be involved in a use of force incident. They are more likely to incur an institutional charge, and they are more likely to be involuntarily transferred. Further, Black prisoners are subject to more frequent and longer placements in structured intervention units. This is the new system that was that used to be called preventive isolation. They incur more institutional charges than their representation among the inmate population would otherwise suggest. Of significant concern, Black individuals are more often designated as security threat group affiliates. Finally, despite overall lower reoffending and lower returns to custody rates, Black individuals are more likely to be assessed as higher risk, low motivation, and low reintegration potential. My colleagues and I heard and documented numerous colleagues where Black prisoners were treated unequally or unfairly, experiencing poor outcomes on nearly every indicator of health and well-being behind bars, from lower inmate pay levels and restricted access to personal care items, and to a lack of meaningful prison employment or a lack of effective case management with a view to obtaining early release from the Correctional Service of Canada. Black individuals interviewed for this investigation consistently reported use of derogatory or racist language by CSE staff. They said that they often felt marginalized, excluded, targeted, and isolated. Of significant concern, Black persons frequently reported being labeled or treated like gang members by CSC staff, even if they did not have any official or active security threat group affiliation. They indicated that staff referred to them as gang members based on a variety of factors, including the neighborhood where they grew up, the people they associate with on their range, groups of Black individuals congregating together, the clothes they wear, or the way they interact with others. We observed that the tendency to view behaviors, language, interactions, or background through a gang lens, through a gang lens is especially detrimental as it makes it difficult for Black prisoners. And it cascades to lower levels of security, obtain gainful employment, or garner support from a assigned case management team. Further, once a gang affiliation is applied to an individual, it is nearly impossible to have it removed, as there are few disaffiliation options or resources offered by CSC. Mr. Zinger. Thank you, Blaise.
Black and in prison in Canada is not a good news story. Unfortunately, racial discrimination and bias follow Black person into federal custody. In updating our previous 2013 findings, this investigation provides an important opportunity for the Correctional Service of Canada to acknowledge and address racist and discriminatory treatment behind bars. I issued 8 recommendations to improve the experiences and outcomes for Black prisoners under federal sentence. Sadly, the responses to my recommendations from the Correctional Service are underwhelming and disappointing. The Correctional Service answered my investigation by promising more sensitivity training, conducting more research projects, and doing more policy reviews. The service's stated commitment of creating, and I quote, an anti-racist organization that is more inclusive, diverse, and equitable looks good on paper. But top-down, corporate-driven diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism frameworks are not likely to reach down to root out the discriminatory and unfair treatment that Black people consistently related to us in the course of this investigation. As I make clear in my report, the lived experiences and needs of Black Canadians are unique and grounded in an historical context of racism and discrimination. That is why I call on the Correctional Service to work in close partnership with Black community groups, stakeholders, and experts in developing and implementing much needed changes for Black prisoners. More practically, increasing representation among CSC frontline staff to reflect the diversity of prisoners' demographics would go a long way to reduce the gap in trust between staff and prisoners. My investigation found that CSC linkages to Black community groups are mostly non-existent. The service does not make it easy for Black community groups to access federal prisons to do in-reach work. None of the changes and reforms recommended in my investigation will happen without the active and sustained involvement of the wider Black community. Although there is no lack of expertise, services, or interventions available within that Black community, there does not appear to be a concerted effort on the part of the service to consult and assist with funding to develop strong partnership with these groups. Finally, in light of recent court decisions in Nova Scotia and the Government of Canada's commitment to extend the use of impact of race and culture assessments at sentencing, the Correctional Service should, as they are required to do with Indigenous case management, adopt a similar approach for Black prisoners. This will ensure that factors contained in those impact assessments are used to inform sentence management. Alors, merci de votre attention.
Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions about this investigation or any other matter dealt with in my 2021-22 annual report. Thank you.
Question period. As a reminder, one question, one follow-up. People using Zoom, it's now time to use the raise hand function. We'll start in the room with Fraser Needham from APTN.
Thank you for joining, me here today, I guess. I guess I'll just shift to the overrepresentation for a second, if you don't mind, of Indigenous people in incarceration. Now, it's 10 years since you released the report. I note here, Spirit Matters, Indigenous Issues in Federal Corrections, and it appears that the things are getting substantially worse then better since you issued that report. Can you? I know there's probably a number of reasons, but could you just maybe highlight some of the reasons why you believe that's the case?
Yeah, so we did a similar kind of work to try to update that 2013 groundbreaking investigation entitled Spirit Matters. And unfortunately, we found that the overrepresentation of Indigenous people over the last decade has continued to grow. We are now looking at the prison population in terms of Indigenous people represent 32% of the overall federally incarcerated individuals. And with respect to women, we, as you know, we sounded the alarm bells when it reached 50% of incarcerated women are Indigenous in federal corrections. We found, again, terrible outcomes with respect to Indigenous people who are incarcerated in federal corrections. And these included, for example, being overrepresented in use of force, overrepresented in maximum security institution, overrepresented in structured intervention units, which is the former administrative segregation regime. They are more likely to also be labeled as gang members. They're more likely to self-injure. They're more likely to attempt suicide. They're also overrepresented in the last fiscal year in terms of suicide. 5 of the 6 individuals that committed suicide last year were Indigenous. They also serve a far greater proportion of their sentences compared to non-Indigenous people. Most of them, the great majority, are being released at statutory release, which is at 2/3. And of course, they tend to do poorly upon release because their needs haven't been properly addressed. So they are more likely to have their parole revoked, and their rates of recidivism is off the chart, reaching out 65%.
Okay, I guess just to follow up on that, I mean, there's probably lots of reasons, but do you have any sort of overriding what you were able to find of why that is getting so much worse?
Well, I think I've made lots of recommendations over the years. I think our office made in excess of 30 recommendations, and the service hasn't followed up very much on many of them. I will tell you that I think the one that is the most promising one to try to address those poor correctional outcomes would be to transfer large amount of the correctional services budget to fund healing lodges and also provide opportunities for Indigenous communities to also supervise Indigenous people in their communities, and that hasn't. It simply hasn't happened on the larger scale that it should have. I have to remind people that those amazing provisions that would allow the Minister of Public Safety to sign agreements with Indigenous communities or group to fund these healing lodges was enacted almost 30 years ago to the day today, and only a handful have been created. And the services, as I indicated in my report, has funneled all the money that was destined for those community initiatives to actually fund initiatives that are in institutions, primarily its pathways programs.
Perfect. Is there any question on the Zoom? Once again, use the raise hand function. There is no question over the Zoom. Do you have any other question, Leon?
Yeah, I do have one more. You sort of you talked a lot about sort of in talking about the overrepresentation of Black population in prison system, that there's a corporate approach, I guess, from Corrections Canada, that they don't include community groups in planning. You you alluded a little bit to it there, and also it's in your report. But is that really the problem? Is that in terms of Indigenous people as well, that Corrections Canada is not reaching out to community groups or involving them in programming?
I think so. So certainly the service has no lack of resources as an organization, and it actually funds a lot of initiatives internally to trying to respond to the unique needs of Indigenous people. However, what we found is that those initiatives are just not reaching out Indigenous people, and they are failing to engage those groups. And I think that is part of the problem that we have. For example, with respect to programming, it's clear to me that the program offered by the service, despite its attempt to make it to respond to the unique needs of Indigenous, isn't having the desirable effects. So it's not an issue of resource, and that's really important to say. The service is extraordinarily well financed. I can tell you that the ratio between staff to prisoners is some of the highest in the world, if not the highest. The services has a ratio of 1.2 staff per prisoner, and spend in excess, if you actually crunch the number, in excess of almost $190,000 a year per incarcerated individuals. These are phenomenal numbers. And for an organization that spends so much money to have poor correctional outcome, especially for Indigenous prisoners as well as for Black prisoners, is a real shame and something that Canadians should be concerned with.
Thank you. There is no more question. Let's conclude the press conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci.